Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to embark on a deep dive into the complex, remarkable, and honestly heavily debated life of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Known all over the world as the Mahatma, or Great Soul, Gandhi is a figure shrouded in immense reverence. But as you'll see, the reality of his 78-year journey is far more intricate than the myths might suggest. Picture this, it's 1931, and Winston Churchill drops this incredibly striking critique, calling Gandhi a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir. It's a quote that brilliantly captures the sheer paradox of Gandhi's existence. On one hand, you have a man who consciously chose to dress in a simple, hand-spun loincloth, projecting a frail physical appearance. But on the other hand, he was a massive existential political threat to the mighty British Empire, negotiating on equal terms with the very representatives of the King Emperor. So that brings us to the ultimate question, doesn't it? How exactly did this happen? How did the guy who started out as a painfully shy, remarkably unsuccessful young lawyer eventually become the architect of a movement that would literally bring down a global empire? To figure that out, we have to trace his entire evolutionary arc. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the making of Mohandas. Then, the South African Crucible, followed by his struggle for independence. Next, we'll dive into principles and complexities, and we'll finish with partition and assassination.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the making of Mohandas. If we travel back to coastal Gujarat in 1869, his future greatness, well, it honestly seemed pretty unlikely. We're talking about a completely average student, married off at just 13, which, to be fair, was customary for the region at the time. But get this. After struggling through his studies in London, he tried to establish a law practice in Bombay, and it was a total disaster. His first practice failed simply because he was completely terrified to even stand up and cross-examine a witness in court. He just completely lacked confidence.
Moving on to Section 2, the South African Crucible. In 1893, Gandhi accepts a one-year contract in South Africa, an environment that quickly became the severe testing ground for his political consciousness. Now, his early views were actually quite complex. When he arrived in the 1890s, he considered himself a Briton first. At that time, his focus was entirely on Indian rights, and historians note he actively argued that Indians shouldn't be grouped with Black Africans, sometimes even using the racial stereotyping of the era. But after enduring severe, humiliating discrimination himself, like literally being violently thrown off trains and kicked into gutters by white officials just because of his skin color, his mindset profoundly shifted. By the 1910s, he had evolved into a unified civil rights activist, organizing strikes and leading diverse groups against highly oppressive colonial laws. And it's out of this intense South African crucible that a revolutionary concept is born. He called it satyagraha, which translates roughly to devotion to the truth or soul force. It was first utilized on a mass scale back in 1906 when the government tried to force Asians to undergo mandatory fingerprint registration and carry identity passes. Gandhi urged people to peacefully defy these biometric laws and willingly suffer the punishments. He discovered something absolutely crucial. You didn't need physical weapons. Moral power and non-cooperation were infinitely stronger. Which brings us to Section 3, Struggle for Independence. So returning to India in 1915 at age 45, Gandhi brings these new methodologies directly against the British Raj. By 1920, he's taken leadership of the Indian National Congress, and what he did next was brilliant. He connected with the rural poor. By adopting the simple loincloth and using vocabulary deeply rooted in Indian tradition, he transformed from a London-trained lawyer into a messiah-like folk hero for millions of Indian peasants. This culminated in massive national campaigns, like the Salt March in 1930 and the definitive Quit India movement of 1942.
Right at the heart of all this massive momentum was the concept of Swaraj. Gandhi completely shifted the Indian struggle. Instead of just respectfully asking the British for minor administrative reforms, he demanded absolute self-reliance and complete independence. He taught the British rule only survived because Indians were cooperating with it. If they fundamentally boycotted British goods, courts, and institutions, the empire would simply collapse.
The sheer scale of this non-cooperation was monumental. Just to put it into perspective, 388 kilometers, or about 241 miles. During the famous 1930 Salt March, Gandhi walked that incredible distance with his followers to the Arabian Sea simply to make his own salt. It was a direct, illegal defiance of the British salt tax. The whole campaign was an absolute masterclass in political theater and mass mobilization. Britain responded by brutally suppressing protests and imprisoning at least 60,000 people. But by then,
The moral victory belonged entirely to Gandhi. Let's pivot slightly to Section 4, Principles and Complexities. To truly understand Gandhi's political methodologies, we have to look closely at his personal life. His daily routine was dictated by a strict adherence to these 5 great vows, heavily derived from Jainism and Hindu yoga philosophy. They were truth, nonviolence, celibacy, non-stealing, and non-attachment. He firmly believed that before you could ever hope to conquer an empire, you first had to conquer your own inner demons, your appetites, and your fears. The most famous of these vows is ahimsa, the highest ethical value of nonviolence. But it's so vital to understand that for Gandhi, ahimsa was never about passive inaction or weakness. It was a brave, incredibly active refusal to retaliate. He viewed nonviolence as infinitely superior to violence for sure, but he notably stated that if the only choice was between cowardice and violence, he would actually advise violence over cowardly submission. His pursuit of these vows, however, led to intensely controversial practices. In the final years of his life, Gandhi sought to test his vows of brahmacharya, or celibacy, by sleeping naked in the same bed as young female associates, which included his own grandnieces. He viewed this as a spiritual experiment to test his purity and conquer sexual desire. This practice deeply disturbed many of his closest followers, leading to heavy criticism and several resignations from his staff, who strongly questioned the psychological impact of these experiments. Finally, we reach Section 5, Partition and Assassination. The 1947 independence of India wasn't exactly a pure, joyous victory for Gandhi. It was actually his ultimate heartbreak. He had spent his entire life fighting for a unified India where Hindus and Muslims lived together. But against his most desperate wishes, political realities led to the partition of the subcontinent into a Hindu-majority India and a Muslim-majority Pakistan. This triggered horrific religious violence, mass displacement of over 10 million people, and up to 500,000 deaths. So, while the rest of the country was celebrating Independence Day, a completely heartbroken Gandhi spent it fasting and spinning in Calcutta, desperately trying to stop the rampant slaughter in the streets. Tragically, his unwavering dedication to religious unity is what ultimately cost him his life. On January 30, 1948, at an interfaith prayer meeting in Delhi, Gandhi was approached by Nathuram Godse, a militant Hindu nationalist. Godse, believing that Gandhi had been far too resolute in his defense of Pakistan and Indian Muslims, fired 3 bullets into the 78-year-old's chest, killing him. The immediate, devastating impact of his death on the newly independent nation was perfectly captured in an emotional, impromptu radio broadcast by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. He told the nation, "The light has gone out of our lives and there is darkness everywhere." The shockwaves of losing Bapu, the father of the nation, plunged the subcontinent into profound sorrow. The man who had shaped the destiny of millions was just suddenly gone. And the scale of global mourning was simply staggering. Over 1 million people joined the massive 5-mile-long funeral procession to watch his body be transported, while another million lined the streets just to catch a glimpse. His ashes were eventually scattered across India and the world, cementing a legacy that would go on to inspire global civil rights leaders from Martin Luther King Jr. to Nelson Mandela. We've traced the incredible, complex evolution of Mohandas Gandhi, from a terrified young lawyer to the architect of a world-changing silent force. Now, I want to leave you with a question to think about. When you look out at the modern world today, what injustices demand a satyagraha of their own? How can we apply the lessons of nonviolent moral power to the conflicts of our own time? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning.